For 35 years, I lived inside courtrooms where truth was treated like currency, where people lied for a living and called it advocacy, where men in tailored suits pretended morality was flexible if the price was right. And yet nothing in my career ever prepared me for the moment that shook me more deeply than any verdict I had ever delivered, a moment that didn't happen under fluorescent lights or behind a judge's bench, but out in the open air, on my own land, watching strangers dismantle a fence that had marked my family's boundary longer than any of them had been alive. And in that instant, I learned something painfully simple. Evil doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it walks onto your property smiling, holding paperwork, and assuming you're too tired, too broken, or too ordinary to fight back. At that time, they had no idea who I really was, and I didn't rush to correct them, not out of strategy at first, but because grief has a way of stripping you of titles and turning you into something smaller, quieter, more human. And after Helen Carter, my wife of 30 years, died from cancer, the house in the suburbs felt less like a home and more like a museum to a life that had ended without asking my permission. Every room echoing with habits that no longer had a reason to exist. Every silence louder than the last conversation we ever had. And that silence eventually pushed me back to Ravenwood Creek, the town where I grew up, where memory still felt warm instead of sharp. My family's old ranch sat just outside town, mostly untouched since my parents passed, about 20 acres of rolling land that caught the light differently at sunrise, a modest two-story farmhouse built sometime in the late 1940s, nothing impressive by modern standards, nothing polished, but honest, the kind of place that creaks at night and reminds you it's still alive. And I told myself I wasn't running away. I was coming home, reconnecting with roots while I figured out how to exist in a world that no longer included the woman who had been my anchor for 3 decades. The ranch needed work, fences sagged, boards warped, weeds grew with stubborn confidence, and I welcomed it because physical labor has a way of keeping the hands busy when the mind wants to wander into dark places. And what made the land truly special was that it bordered the property of Samuel Brooks, my father's oldest friend, the man who taught me to ride horses when I was barely tall enough to climb into a saddle. Now nearing 80, his face carved with time, history, and a kindness the modern world had very little patience for. When I told Samuel I was moving back, he insisted on selling me 5 acres of his adjoining land, a narrow strip that included a small creek where he and my father used to fish, where I spent summers barefoot and careless. And when he called me kid the way he always had, his voice cracking but his eyes steady, and said that land belonged with my family, that Helen would have loved it here, I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months, a reminder that not everything worth holding on to had already been lost. At 58, I wasn't ready for a rocking chair, but I wasn't chasing ambition either. The federal district court had granted me extended leave, a sabbatical of sorts. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't Judge Carter, the man attorneys whispered about in hallways. I was just Max, a widower trying to rebuild a life that cancer had dismantled piece by piece. One of the few people who knew my real position was Deputy Sheriff Laura Mitchell, an old high school friend who had chosen a badge while I chose the bench, and reconnecting with her felt like rediscovering a version of myself I thought had been buried under years of responsibility. And over coffee at the diner, she warned me casually about Oak Ridge Valley Association, an HOA that had appeared a few years earlier and expanded aggressively, swallowing surrounding properties under the banner of community improvement, backed by city council connections that made complaints quietly disappear. I listened, nodded, half interested, because compared to grief, an HOA sounded like a minor inconvenience, a bureaucratic mosquito at worst, and I hate admitting this, but I underestimated how dangerous small power becomes when it's convinced no one is watching. 3 weeks after finalizing the paperwork for Samuel's 5 acres, that illusion shattered. Rosa Alvarez, who helped around the ranch a few days a week, called me while I was in town, her voice tight with panic, telling me there were men moving my fence, claiming they had permission. And by the time I drove back, judicial calm already giving way to irritation, I found a crew dismantling the old boundary fence that had stood for decades, replacing it with a pristine white one planted nearly 15 feet inside my actual property line, like someone drawing a new reality and daring me to. Object. The man directing the operation introduced himself as Derek Lane, landscaping supervisor for Oak Ridge Valley Association, speaking with rehearsed confidence, waving a map that immediately offended every legal instinct I had. No seals, no certifications, no county markings, just lines drawn where they wanted them. And when I told him politely that he was trespassing and needed to stop, he sighed the way people do when they think you're slow and told me I could bring my concerns to Clifford Hayes, the HOA president, at the next board meeting. That was the moment I started recording. When Deputy Mitchell arrived, the tone shifted instantly. Tools slowed, voices dropped, and she shut the operation down on the spot, telling them they had no authority to alter private property without a court order. But the damage was already done, my fence gone, their stakes standing like flags of occupation. And before she left, she warned me quietly that Hayes wasn't loud or reckless, he was connected. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I reviewed deeds, survey maps, zoning records, and HOA filings, their website polished and friendly on the surface, while resident complaints told a darker story: arbitrary fines, aggressive expansion, intimidation disguised as governance. And by the time I closed my laptop, I wasn't just angry about a fence, I was worried about what this organization was doing to people without the knowledge or resources to fight back. The next evening, I attended the HOA meeting. The clubhouse looked imported, oversized and out of place among ranches and farmhouses, and inside, about 30 residents sat facing a raised platform where Clifford Hayes presided like a man who had never been told no, welcoming me publicly, smiling thinly, accusing my property of violations before I'd even finished sitting down, then offering solutions that sounded a lot like surrender, join the HOA, comply, sell, if necessary. When I asked for original deeds and notarized agreements, he produced a document supposedly signed by Samuel Brooks, claiming the 5 acres were already approved for HOA incorporation, and something inside me went cold because the signature was wrong, shaky, hesitant, not the steady hand I knew. And when I looked up, Emily Dawson, the HOA secretary, couldn't meet my eyes. Outside, she whispered that documents weren't always obtained cleanly, that other landowners had been pressured the same way. And when I later showed Samuel the document, sitting on his porch wrapped in a blanket, he told me the truth. Hayes and Martin Cole, the HOA's attorney, had visited him in the hospital months earlier, calling the papers routine, letting medication and trust do the rest. That was the moment this stopped being about land. From that point on, everything moved with purpose. Professional surveys commissioned, county records quietly pulled, affidavits collected, and when Rebecca Stone, a real estate attorney sharp enough to make developers nervous, reviewed the evidence, she said exactly what I was thinking. This wasn't an accident, it was a system. The HOA retaliated quickly. Violation notices, daily fines, veiled threats, and a visit from Martin Cole himself, standing on my porch in an expensive suit that looked ridiculous against dust and open sky, offering a peaceful resolution: join the HOA, submit, or sell the property to Ironcliff Development Group. And as he talked about peace and quiet retirement, I nodded politely, asked questions, and recorded every word, because bullies get careless when they think they've already won. When we filed for an emergency injunction, the courtroom filled with HOA supporters, Hayes confident, smiling, until the judge asked me to clarify my professional background, and I answered calmly that I was a senior judge of the federal district court, currently on extended leave, and the silence that followed felt physical. The final blow came when Natalie Cole, Martin's wife, stepped forward with emails, financial records, and internal messages outlining a coordinated land grab scheme involving the HOA, the developer, and local officials. And before denial could form, federal investigators entered the courtroom. The injunction was granted, criminal investigations launched, and in the months that followed, Hayes, Cole, and their partners were convicted, land returned, the HOA dissolved, replaced by a community council led by Emily Dawson, who chose conscience over comfort when it mattered most. My fence was rebuilt, Samuel's land protected permanently through a conservation easement, scholarships established for local children, including one for Cole's daughter, because justice isn't revenge, it's responsibility. Now the ranch is quiet again, sunsets uninterrupted, grief softer, My friendship with Laura deepened into something honest and steady, and when I look across the land, I know this fight was worth every sleepless night. No one stands above the law. Not HOAs, not developers, not men who think intimidation can replace legitimacy. So tell me, if an HOA crossed your boundary, would you fight or would you walk away? And where do you draw the line between justice and surrender? If you've lived through something like this, share your story below. And remember, you never know who's standing on the other side of the fence.